Welcome everyone to this event organized by the Center for Competitive Advantage in the Global Economy for the Social Science Festival of 2021. It's good to see you all here. Our topic today is COVID recovery. What can we learn from the experience of the Second World War? We have with us two speakers, Nicholas Crafts and Duncan Weldon. It is my great pleasure to welcome them to this panel. Both of them had made some of the most interesting contributions to the history of Britain's economic development. And today we are here at this very critical juncture in the aftermath of the pandemic where, suddenly the role of big government has become really important. There's a big fiscal deficit. Fiscal policy is more important today than at any other time in recent years. And the question we can ask is, what can we learn from history and what are the lessons that we can borrow from the historical experience of this country? The two people who can answer this question are Professor Nick Crafts. He's professor of economics at Sussex and emeritus professor at Warwick Economics. Nick and I have been colleagues for many years. Nick has held positions in many places, including the LSE, Oxford, and Berkeley. The Center for Competitive Advantage in the Global Economy was set up by Nick, and he was the director of CAGE for 10 years. Nick has always viewed economic growth and decline through the lens of historical experience. And everything that happens today, Nick can always come up with an example from history. So Nick's work changed the way we looked at the Industrial Revolution in Britain. He's looked at productivity growth in the UK. He's looked at the British decline in the 20th century. He's always got examples from history to inform our understanding of today's events. Duncan Weldon, who's our second speaker, is economist. He's a renowned journalist and a writer. He's worked for various organizations such as the Newsnight and The Economist. And his recent book, 200 Years of Muddling Through, The Surprising Story of Britain's Economy from Boom to Bust and Back Again, has made headlines recently. His book covers the long span of Britain's economic position in the world since the 19th century, and he's talked about the decline of this economic hegemony of Britain, how that declined in the 20th century. What is so special about Duncan's book is that he's looked at this economic development through the lens of political change and the various governments and the policies of these different governments and the changing economic environment in the global economy. So we are delighted to have both of them here today to talk us through the recent changes and what we can learn from history. I will invite Nick to take the floor first. Both Nick and Duncan will have 15 minutes, and Duncan will respond to some of the issues that will be raised by Nick. There will be 5 minutes of questions after each presentation. So please put your questions in the chat and we can take it from there. So welcome to both of you, Nick and Duncan, and I will pass on the virtual floor to Nick now.
Thank you very much, Bishnu. Let's start straight away. We've got just 15 minutes. That's the topic, as we heard. On to the next slide, please. Okay, so why would we want to look at post-World War II economic history? Well, I think we'd be looking at the immediate period after the war, and we're told to do so by lots of commentators. Lansley in Prospect magazine, I think, sums it up quite well. A good start for the post-pandemic society would be to learn the lessons of the 1940s. So I'm going to try and extract one or two. If you are a follower of politics, you might have come across Keir Starmer's flagship lecture in the spring, New Chapter for Britain. A lot of that was about invoking the spirit of the 1940s. Next slide. So the issues that I'm going to talk about are dealing with the large aftermath of a big public debt relative to GDP. We had that situation more so than today after World War II. I'm going to think about some reforms of the welfare state that actually a modern updated version of Beveridge might possibly offer. The Beveridge plan was, of course, a major part of that post-1945 reform drive. And I'm going to look at improving productivity performance, which has been very poor in the recent past up till the pandemic, the 10 years or so before then. There was rapid productivity growth after World War II. So can we learn from the policies they used? These three things are related in the sense that improving productivity performance is crucial for faster economic growth. Faster economic growth would contribute considerably to dealing with the debt problem. And dealing with the debt problem would actually prepare us for possibly coping with a future pandemic or whatever. The reform of the welfare state, in turn, feeds in, I think, to sustaining productivity performance in the long run. And I'll try and explain how that argument works as we go through. So next slide, please. Dealing with the debt after World War II, the public debt to GDP ratio fell very rapidly. I'll show you some numbers in just a second. It was a ratio about twice in 1950, had fallen to about 2/3 by 1970. The interesting thing to us is they did it without running massive budget surpluses. In fact, the overall budget was typically in a small deficit during those post-war years. Even primary budget surpluses, for those familiar with the concept, were only a little over 2% of GDP. The debt ratio fell, but the welfare state was expanded. That's a trick one might like to pull off today. What were the key ingredients that I want to point to? I want to point to the post-war boom, in particular the fact that economic growth was very rapid, and a policy stance which was used at the time, which I'll call financial repression, explained on the next slide. Next slide, please. Financial repression then means holding down the interest rate on government borrowing, and ideally holding it down well below the rate of growth that you can achieve. Holding down the interest rate is done, if you like, by forcing it to be below the free market rate, exploiting captive holders of the debt. Who were the captive holders? Well, more than anybody else in the post-war years, the banks, who were forced to hold large amounts of various kinds of public debt. If you're thinking of the more wide general public holding public debt, of course they did, they were limited in their options as to what else to do by capital controls, which stopped them investing abroad. The Bank of England didn't try to control inflation through interest rates. It was much more interested in managing the government's problem in servicing the debt. Low interest rates helped there. Next slide, please. And there are some numbers just to show that I'm not making it all up. The 1950 ratio, if we wanted to be precise, 199.5% of GDP, public debt, down to 64.7. You can do an arithmetic decomposition of where the change came from. The difference between interest rates and growth rates, the fact the growth rate was well above the interest rate, contributes considerably more than budget surpluses to the decrease that we see. That's the point I was making a moment ago. Next slide, please. What lessons should we take from this? Well, I think the idea of financial repression is actually quite an interesting one. I don't think we could do it in quite the same way as they did in the 1950s. for a variety of reasons, many of which will probably occur to you. But I think there is an interesting opportunity for what I'll call new style financial repression. The legacy of quantitative easing is that the Bank of England now holds huge bank reserves, which have been accumulated in the context of the purchase of assets from the agents in the economy. About £900 billion worth at the moment. It would be perfectly possible tomorrow to freeze most of those reserves and stop paying interest on them. We pay interest at the moment. You need to pay interest on some bank reserves, I think, in order to conduct monetary policy, but there is quite a large opportunity there. If we don't take that opportunity, then as interest rates return to something more like normal, the cost of servicing the government debt is going to rise. Dealing with the debt becomes much harder. So there might be ways of helping to at least partly keep down the rate of interest, but crucially, much more important, I think, in a way, is to raise G, the growth rate. So the growth rate pushed up would be a big help in dealing with this problem, and fast growth really underpinned the success of the post-war government. Next slide, please. Second problem I wanted to touch on is reforming the welfare state. As I mentioned earlier, the name of the game in the 1940s was the so-called Beveridge Plan, which was largely implemented by the government. Beveridge promised freedom from want. To us, that would mean no one in poverty, and an end of means testing, so people got benefits as of right when certain things happened to them, like unemployment or disability or whatever. He also promised that what his plan would do would be to deliver social insurance. I think that's a really important idea, but I don't think he did it. In fact, actually, the Beveridge Plan didn't do any of the things that Beveridge promised. Poverty certainly wasn't eliminated, however you measure it. And it also remained the case that many people were on national assistance, about 2 million in the 1960s. That was a means-tested benefit. So I'm afraid Beveridge actually delivered a false prospectus. Next slide, please. There are some numbers, again, just to show that I'm not completely making it up. On a relative income measure, less than 60% of median income, then 13.2% of households were in poverty in the early 1950s. It's not possible to measure with great precision, but my best estimate is about 16% had been in poverty in 1938. There are increases in social expenditure, and certainly as one moves into the longer term, they become quite big as the plan fully unfolds. But that key prospectus achievement of no poverty, that is definitely not achieved. Next slide, please. What about social insurance? Well, I think we need to get the concept straight, and we need to think about it as an economist. As an economist, you'd think that social insurance is the provision of state insurance where private insurance is infeasible, risks against which you couldn't privately insure, and that we think of as a market failure. That will occur if risks are correlated. Let's say the whole of the population, the risk hits at the same time, or costs are unquantifiable, or the response of government is totally unpredictable. Think of COVID. Essentially, it's an uninsurable risk, unless you're an insurance company who didn't write the policy correctly. COVID fits into the same category as war damage, which is typically uninsurable. It's an excludable in property insurance contracts. One aspect of social insurance, which is, I think, quite important, is to insure workers against the consequence of job loss. I think the ideal with a quite high replacement income for a short period of time, at least a short period of time. In the jargon, that's sometimes called flexicurity. You protect the worker, not the job. You allow jobs actually to disappear if technology says they should, but you try and protect the worker from some of the worst consequences. That would be social insurance. That is not really what Beveridge offered. Next slide, please. So lessons for today: we should take social insurance seriously, and the British welfare state never has done that. The failure to think in the terms, the concepts that I've just been enunciating is starkly seen in social care. Interestingly, the Beveridge scheme did not include social care. Social care is essentially an uninsurable risk in private insurance terms, as the Dilnot report points out very clearly. We should be dealing with that. I'm suggesting today we probably need social insurance more than ever, in the sense of protecting the population against something which we can think of as catastrophic risk. Might be needed in the context of climate change, cyber attacks, future pandemics. We had to invent a social insurance scheme in the recent pandemic. That was the furlough. It's not what it's usually called, but that was the function that it offered. Next slide, please. Third of my topics is improving productivity performance. And as I say, I think that's the key to faster economic growth, which has all sorts of desirable consequences in terms of recovery. That requires policies that are good for investment and innovation. I think it requires strong competition. Crucially, it requires creative destruction and absorptive capacity. Jargon phrases. Creative destruction means allowing new processes, new products to gain the day. Old ones disappear, they exit. So technological change is a process of entry and exit. It has a dark side to it, which needs to be dealt with. Absorptive capacity is about the ability to use new technology. It's about skills, knowledge, doing perhaps necessary bits of R&D, and so on. The key to improving productivity performance in the UK is to improve the diffusion of new technology rapidly across the economy. I said we had fast growth after the war, but actually I think productivity performance disappointed. Let's see some numbers. Next slide. There is labour productivity growth, output per hour worked, for the period between 1950 and 1973, the period usually singled out as the very fast post-war growth. Britain did do very well. The UK's productivity growth was 3.7% per year. Seen in the context only of British economic history, that's wonderful. But we notice immediately that other countries, our peer group, France and West Germany actually on the slide, were doing better. So was almost all the rest of Europe. Next slide, please. The consequence of not growing as quickly as those other countries in terms of productivity is that they overtook us. Whereas France and Germany had productivity levels below that of the UK in 1950, in 1973 they were about 12% ahead. I think that signals that there was some sort of failure, and I think policy was quite largely responsible for it. Next slide, please. And as an economist, you'd think then about supply side policy. I think we ended up with an economy in which competition was very weak. Protectionism ruled the day, high tariffs and so on. Competition policy was very weak. Originally, there were lots of cartels which were not tackled by government and so on. Policy put a very high premium on avoiding unemployment and trying to get that to go hand in hand with low inflation. The governments of the day wanted wage restraint. They designed supply side policy to please unions and get themselves votes rather than to improve productivity. This in the end undermined incentives, the most obvious feature being the really astonishing tax system, where it was not too difficult to end up paying a marginal income tax rate of 97%. Next slide, please. Lessons for today from this last part, the productivity performance. I don't think they did have a good pro-productivity policy. So the best thing I can suggest here is not to repeat the post-1945 mistakes. The second point I'd make is creative destruction does matter, but we're at a point where lots of people once again distrust capitalism or the market economy as they did after 1945. Since there will be job losses in this technological progress, the important thing is that workers and population more generally are willing to accept that. That, I think, implies the need in the medium term for a relatively high degree of protection for workers. Recognizing that government failure is a major obstacle to productivity improvement is crucial. That implies we don't let government have too much discretion to mess things up. That, I think, is a danger of the post-Brexit period, when government now has more discretion than it did. That hasn't been exercised well in the past. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're at the end. What are my conclusions? I can certainly see why Keir Starmer says we might want to admire the spirit of 1945. I'm happy with that. There was a concerted effort to improve society. I think they got many things wrong, but at least they tried. But admiring the spirit of 1945 should not be confused with adopting or going back to their policies. In particular, the post-1945 period certainly does not offer a blueprint for reform of the welfare state. Beveridge's plans were extremely badly designed, and anyone who says back to Beveridge needs to go and lie down for a considerable period of time. Nor is that period one which will help us address the productivity puzzle. We need more competition, not less, to get that to work. The message I would really like to take away, though, from the late 1940s is their idea, the rhetoric of achieving social insurance. But I want that to be taken seriously in the sense of insuring the population against catastrophic losses which the private sector cannot cope with. That the post-1945 period certainly did not achieve. Thank you. I can't hear you, Bishnu.
Sorry, thank you, Nick. Fascinating talk as always. In particular, your comments on the Beveridge reforms, which most of us think very differently from the way you put forward, and it's fascinating. I want to take up a couple of the questions that have come through the chat. One of the first questions relate to your point about productivity growth in Britain and why it kind of fell behind. So the question is about what did France and Germany do differently, which allowed them to do better in terms of their productivity performance?
Both those countries, I think, were exposed to more competition than the UK, and especially so once they joined the EEC. Joining the European Economic Community was a crucial way of avoiding some of the mistakes that we made. It led to lower tariffs, it led to more market entry by competitors, and so on. West Germany also did, I think, much better in dealing with what we might call the trade union problem in this period. And in that context, they had a very different institutional design. That institutional design we could think of as a sort of cooperative market economy. There's a large literature on that. I don't think we were in a position to do that, but what we could have done would have been to reform industrial relations to take away the more damaging elements which Germany had managed to avoid through our help in redesigning their unions after the war. So it was important, or would have been important, to bring unions properly under the auspices of the rule of law. That didn't happen until many decades later. So I think we're seeing participation in European integration being something that we stood aside from, but which was really quite potent way to increase growth in that period.
Thank you. Another question that I see in the chat is that you have talked a lot about social insurance. How should we think of funding it? Is it through raising the income tax? I mean, that may be controversial, but that's one aspect. And the other aspect is that you have talked about protecting the worker rather than the job. Does this mean more generous unemployment insurance?
Let me take the second one first, if I may. I think what one would need here is what might be called vigorous, active labour market policies. They're typically a combination of trying to protect against dramatic income loss in the short term, combined with opportunities to retrain, seriously strong incentives to look for work or be disqualified from receiving the insurance, and so on. So that's the general idea of the flexicurity approach. Turning to how you might pay for it, I think it's difficult to think that we're not in a period where, looking at the welfare state as a whole and including this element, the general level of taxes in the UK will have to go up. I think one's got to be a bit cautious about how to design the increase in taxes. I think we've probably run out of road in terms of increasing national insurance. And the recent attempt to pay for health and social care that way, I think probably is inferior to having tried to fund it through income taxes. But I think we've got quite a wide range of options for new taxes. And one which might certainly be thought of as quite important is taxing wealth and capital gains, as our colleague Aaron Advani at Cage has been advocating quite vigorously recently. So I think maybe increases in income tax would be a part, but I don't think they should be the whole thing. And there is a danger, if we aren't careful, of returning to the high marginal tax rates, which were an unfortunate feature of the 1950s and 60s.
Thank you, Nick. I can see several other questions, but I want to bring Duncan in now. So maybe we can come back to some of these questions later on. So over to you, Duncan. You have the virtual floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for a very kind introduction, and thank you for having me on this panel with Nick Crafts, which is a great honor. I'm a journalist. I've written a book on economic history, but when I got invited to do this event with Nick, I sort of felt a bit like a cover musician being invited to support the Beatles. It was quite a big moment, and I'm very grateful that you have me here. I thought that was a wonderfully interesting presentation. I agree with a great deal of it, and there's a few points I thought it would be useful to pick out, to respond to, and then to throw open the floor to questions. But I think it's always worth, we're talking about the sort of post-war record and the economic policies of the 1940s in Britain, reminding ourselves, and this is an obvious point, but one that I think sometimes gets missed out, reminding ourselves it was the Attlee government was a post-war government. And I think, the fair comparison of the Attlee government is to the governments at the end of the Great War, or the governments at the end, if you want to go back earlier, to the Napoleonic Wars. With this, we sort of got this amongst the general public. There is sometimes almost this lazy assumption that post-war booms are just a thing that happens. But, the more usual experience of British economic history has been post-war busts rather than post-war booms. And if you look at that economic record of the late 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s in Britain, as Nick said, the absolute levels of growth relative to anything else in British economic history were very high, even if the relative performance compared to Western Europe was not as good as we might have hoped, but the absolute level of growth was very strong. But if you compare that to the experience of the 1920s and the 1930s in the aftermath of the Great War, it's a very, very strong performance. I think, governments learned lessons from mishandling the end of the Great War, which were put into effect, and the demobilization at the end of the Second World War was just handled much better. And part of that was a story of government debt. Um, Both the First World War and the Second World War saw very large leaps in the debt to GDP ratio, the kind of leap we've seen in the last decade after the financial crisis and then after the pandemic. And that debt burden was dealt with in two very different ways. Now, Nick spoke about how debt was handled after the Second World War. This phrase, financial repression. A very different approach was attempted after the First World War and the 1920s into the early 1930s. Britain saw very high levels of debt, very high levels of interest payment, which was swallowing up more and more tax revenues, and the British state sort of lurches from fiscal crisis to fiscal crisis, have a very austere public spending approach. It was much messier. It was handled much better in the 1950s and the 1960s, this approach of financial repression, of artificially setting interest rates low, of forcing captive buyers to buy British government debt. And it's worth noting Britain was not alone in this. You saw similar policies across Western Europe, even in the United States. Financial repression varies country by country, but probably accounts for between half and 2/3 of the reduction in debt ratios you see in the 1950s and the 1960s. I mean, the one thing I would say is, calling it financial repression is what it tends to be called. It's not particularly attractive sounding title. It doesn't sound like something you'd want to engage in. I'm almost tempted to say we should rename it historically successful debt management policies. That's how we should think about it. It's certainly a much better track record than what happened in the 20s and 30s. Now, I think Nick's comments on um, will we see, or could we see even, a new financial repression in the aftermath of quantitative easing is very interesting. I mean, to one extent, there are people out there in financial markets. I'm dressed unusually smartly today as I spent the morning talking to financial markets investors. There are people out there in the markets at the moment who think we're already seeing a form of financial repression, who would point out that the single largest holder of British government debt now is the Bank of England. Over the previous 18 or so months, the monthly purchases by the Bank of England as part of its quantitative easing program have more or less tracked monthly net issuance by the government. That quietly, the bank has at least temporarily monetized a lot of the government's borrowing over the past year and a half, even over the past 10 years. It is on one level really striking that although debt to GDP is back up to about 100%, the actual level relative to the size of the economy of British government debt is now the highest it's been since the early 1960s. The actual cost of servicing that debt is the lowest it's been in at least 60 or 70 years. Um, Interest rates are incredibly low. The government can borrow for 10 years at just over 1% at the moment. Debt to GDP might be very high, but interest costs as a percentage of tax revenues are the lowest they've been in about a century. Some people would say we're already seeing a form of financial repression. And it's worth thinking through for a moment the strange impact quantitative easing has on the government's debt bill. On one level, what the central bank is doing from a government fiscal point of view when it engages in quantitative easing is swapping some of the government's debt from paying longer term interest rates, as it buys up 10 or 15-year government debt, with really short term interest rates, the reserves, the bank rate they pay on bank reserves. Now, that's had the effect of lowering the government's interest bills over the last 10 years. But as Nick said, if the Bank of England starts, as it looks like it may do in the coming months, to raise short-term bank rates to control inflation, the government is more exposed to that move than it would have been previously because of all of these reserves the bank has issued. I think Nick is completely right that although the bank currently pays interest on all of those reserves, there's no reason it has to. In fact, we've seen the Bank of Japan, we've seen the Swiss National Bank, we've seen the European Central Bank move to reduce tiering in terms of how much they pay on different types of bank reserves. We could do that, and given the alternatives, of having to set very, very tight fiscal policy, financial repression or some new form of financial repression seems the way to go. We shouldn't pretend it's cost-free. There is a cost incurred. There's a cost incurred by investors. There's a cost paid by pension savers, by the financial system as a whole. But we should be upfront about that. I agree. In terms of Nick's discussion of social insurance, I thought it was interesting. And again, experimenting with new forms of social insurance is something I think we should be looking at. Now, I do wonder if there is, to an extent, a trade-off between forms of social insurance and some of that creative destruction we need. I think we saw a really interesting sort of transatlantic experiment during the pandemic in terms of the policies designed to cope with the pandemic, particularly on the labour market. Britain, in common with most of Western Europe, went for a furlough type scheme, very similar to some of the short time working schemes which have been longer in use in other parts of Europe. But, in Britain, we very much decided at the start of the pandemic to focus on keeping workers attached to firms. Through the furlough scheme, the government would pay 80% of the wages of a furloughed worker up to £2,500 a month. The US went down a very different route. It focused its labour market response on protecting worker incomes rather than protecting jobs. So you saw a very, very large temporary rise in unemployment insurance, and you saw very different dynamics. So in Britain, despite this huge recession and then the recovery, unemployment remained very, very low by historical standards, stayed under 5% despite GDP contracting by 20% at one phase. The furlough scheme, we paid people to stay attached to the same jobs. In the US, you saw an immediate, very large spike in unemployment to up to sort of 15-16% levels at the end of last spring. But worker incomes were protected because although people were losing their jobs, they were suddenly receiving this bonus $600 temporary unemployment insurance. And it's an interesting one. And I still think it's too early to say as to which approach worked better. The US protected incomes, we protected jobs. There were some firms out there complaining that the pandemic has led to shifts in consumer behavior. And our attempt to protect jobs, they say, sort of froze the labor market in place. So you had this point when, your Amazons of this world were desperately trying to ramp up capacity to hire more warehouse workers, more delivery drivers. You had people working in the shutdown or not working. You had people furloughed by the hospitality and bits of the consumer service sector. In the US system, presumably it would have been easier for workers to move directly. In Britain, they were sort of frozen in place. Now, I think actually the benefit of keeping people attached to their firms probably will be worth it, but there is a trade-off, I think, there between your creative destruction and your social insurance. I think it really comes down to a judgment call on one level as to how long lasting we think some of the changed consumer behaviors brought about by the pandemic are going to be. On simply, your typical Brit in the last 18 months has used an awful lot less consumer services than in the past. They've gone to the pub less, they've eaten out less, they've gone to the hairdressers less, and they've bought an awful lot more goods than previously, and probably used Amazon a lot more. How long will that last? If that is a lasting change in consumer behavior, then we probably do need resources, in this case workers, to move to the warehousing sector, to move to delivery. If, on the other hand, this is all just part of the pandemic, then I think a focus on protecting jobs rather than directly protecting workers probably was the right call. I think Nick's final points on productivity. It's worth putting in context that even if we hadn't had the pandemic in 2020, 2021, then the 2020s were going to be a very important decade for Britain for a number of reasons. Firstly, the most obvious one, this is the decade in which Brexit, which we've been talking about for so long, has actually happened. Britain has now left its transitional membership of the European Customs Union and the European Single Market. A load of restraints on government action, which came with being in the single market, have been taken away, and the government now has to make sort of real choices about how much it wants to use that new freedom. The British government is now much freer to engage in sort of state aid and that sort of policy, which it's not been able to do for years. Is it going to or not? These are real choices that will shape how the supply side of the British economy develops. We can decide to hold on to some of the openness we enjoyed within the European Union, or we can decide to become more insular. These are all choices that will have to be made now in the 2020s, which have really not been sort of inside the framework of British policy for a long time. This was all outsourced to the European Union. That all matters. The 2020s are, of course, also the decade in which the sort of the carbon transition, the aims to get to net zero emissions by 2050. It's the 2020s when lots of those decisions have to be made. If you look at the Climate Change Committee's projections, we have to spend an awful lot in the 2020s. We have to make a series of policy choices in the 2020s and the 2030s if we're going to hit those targets. You've also got demographic change in the 2020s. We've been talking about an aging workforce for a very long time. It's the 2020s in which you start to see some of those really decisive shifts in the dependency ratio. So the 2020s are going to be a big decade even without the pandemic, the decade of Brexit, the decade of transition to net zero, the decade of demographic shift. To that, you've now added the pandemic and this question of to what extent are these changes in consumer behavior going to linger? To what extent is the pandemic going to reshape economic geography? Some people call it the Zoom shock. Are we now going to see much more working from home than in the past in certain jobs? Are we going to see maybe sort of an undermining of some of those amalgamation effects? Are city centres going to be less important? And of course, as Nick said, the legacy of high government debt sits beyond it. Now, I'm with Nick on this. That I think it's important that we maintain competition. I think it's my sort of short history of British productivity since the Second World War would be very much based on Nick's. That we saw in the 1950s and 1960s a more insular economy, less exposed to foreign competition, more cartelized, not a very active competition policy. Governments focused on preserving jobs. Bits of the dynamism of the economy were allowed to fester. People talk about the British disease. They say, was it, difficult industrial relations? Was it poor management? Was it a lack of scientific education? Was it underinvestment? It's probably some of all of those. But I think the key point is those are problems which are allowed to root in and fester because there wasn't enough competition. Now, I worry after Brexit, after we've left the European Customs Union, after we've left the single market, we will see a less competitive British economy. And I think that's where I would end by saying if that lack of competition is allowed to return, if our already weak productivity growth becomes weaker, then you can try all of the financial repression you want. You can try creating all of the new social insurance you want. But if you don't have that underlying growth, then you're going to find yourself in a very bad place by the end of the 2020s. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. You've given, both of you, in particular, your response have given us a lot to think about how policies are going to shape up in the years to come. I have a couple of questions, and maybe, Duncan, you can start with the first one. So it's about the question of social insurance. You have talked a lot about social insurance, but not so much about redistribution. What does the post-war experience teach us about redistribution, and how should we think of it going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on which metric you're looking at as well. I mean, Britain by the 1970s was in many ways a much more equal country, whether you're looking at sort of pay distribution between the top and the bottom, or or the regional distribution of growth. Sort of 1950s, 1960s, you saw sort of more of a convergence in output. Obviously, in the 80s and the 90s, that reversed. We saw a large rise in inequality in the 1980s in Britain through to the early 1990s. If you're looking at Gini coefficients in general, inequality hasn't risen very much since the 1990s, but there is a renewed focus on it from the 2010s onwards. I think that's partially because we had a decade of pretty stagnant median wages, and I think that sort of focused attention on, there were some people who had done very well out of that sort of post 1979 settlement. It's an interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think in the end, if you want more redistribution, if you want to tackle and reverse some of that rise in inequality at sort of the pay level, and particularly at the wealth level that we saw in the 1980s and 1990s, that's really a question for politics. I mean, to get all political economy about it, I think we've got a government who are unusually reliant on the votes of older people, who are unusually reliant on the votes of asset holders in the form of property owners, and I don't see them, I don't see them going down the route of trying to redistribute income away from their core voting base. I think Nick was completely right that if you're looking at the UK tax system, it's I mean, the obvious place to look in terms of additional tax revenues and in terms of broadening the tax base are into the taxation of wealth. And in the UK, that means the taxation of property. But we know the taxation of property in Britain is incredibly politically fraught.
So that brings me to the question of redistribution, intergenerational redistribution versus, redistribution across social groups. So maybe, Nick, you have a couple of thoughts on that.
I mean, let me say first of all that I don't think the 1940s saw a massive redistribution of income. There is some, but if you look at the sort of scale of redistribution, it was probably 8% of GDP before World War II and maybe 13% afterwards. It's an uptick, but it's not an absolutely dramatic change. And again, interestingly, Beveridge himself was against using the welfare state as a form of redistribution. He actually wanted to design it as what he thought was an insurance system, and explicitly forewent redistribution. He sort of saw them as separate things, I suspect. If we're talking of intergenerational redistribution or the distribution of income between generations, I do think that the older generation has been unduly favoured by recent policies. I'm not myself a believer in the triple lock, for example. I think that is far too generous to pensioners. I also think there are a number of policies which actually have to do with efficiency but have generational consequences. So the most important policy to think about, I suspect, policy area, is land use planning. Land use planning has all sorts of distortionary effects on production, but crucially, it is why British house prices are so high. And if you ask what is so different for at least a kind of middle class British person about life today compared with when I was in my 20s or whatever, it is access to owning property. That has just, certainly in the south of England, that has just become completely different. That is a problem which on both efficiency and equity grounds needs to be addressed.
Duncan, do you have a couple of things to say?
Yeah. I mean, I agree that the housing, I mean, if you're talking about intergenerational equality in Britain, then a lot of it comes down to a housing story. I agree on that. Now, I am unsure how much of that is to do with the planning system, which I think is is a driver, particularly around the Greater Southeast and the the extent of the Greenbelt, etc., and how much of that is an interest rate story. In that, interest rates have collapsed, real interest rates have collapsed over the last 30, 40 years. You'd expect asset prices to rise as a result. And although house prices have soared since the 1990s, mortgage costs have the actual percentage of people's income swallowed up in mortgage bills has remained relatively constant. Lower interest rates, higher asset prices. So I'm not sure that just planning reform and even just building more is the answer. You then start getting into questions about either mortgage availability, which I think really is an issue. And what I find very frustrating when you speak to people in their 20s or early 30s who find themselves living in the private rented sector and are paying more for their rent than they would on a mortgage, but are being told they cannot, that they're not. They cannot get the mortgage. I mean, it's a very, so either get yourself into mortgage availability questions, or you start looking at what can we do to make the private rental sector a more attractive place to live in Britain. Policy has sort of ignored the sector for a very long time. You talk to a lot of politicians, they still think of it almost as a waiting room where you spend a bit of time before you have the joys of looking after your own boiler. But what we know is people are renting for longer and longer. The demographics are changing. Something like 1 in 5 families with children in London are now in the private rented sector. It's still a very unregulated sector, and maybe we need to start looking at things like security of tenure, at different ownership models if we want to improve the housing experience of younger people, which I think is the biggest thing you can do for intergenerational equality in Britain.
Thank you. The last question is, so relevant today, which is on the environment. So can we think of post-COVID recovery in terms of investment in environmental rebuilding? And how does the government debt figure in this? It's like, there's a debt which is being incurred as investment rather than something else. So how do you both think about that?
Shall I start, Vishnu?
Yeah, sure, please.
Okay, I mean, clearly environmental policy is crucially important at the moment. I think we all know the reasons why. Let's summarize the main one as climate change, if you like. And we do seem to be on a path towards trying to achieve net zero. It's fairly clear to me that that's going to involve a considerable amount of government investment. And we do, I think, probably imagine that if we set some sort of borrowing rule, we'd have a different view about borrowing for what we might call government consumption compared with government investment. Most fiscal rules make that distinction. I think that will probably continue. I think what we need to do if we want a government that can on occasions be fiscally active, and this might be entailed in this environmental policy, is to make sure that the government has fiscal space, to make sure that it is capable of expanding borrowing in a hurry if it needs to, and so on. I think that is a reason for saying be a very good idea not to let the debt to GDP ratio explode for sort of inconsequential reasons. Let's do it when we have a good purpose to do it. So what I think one would like to do would be to put government debt and its sustainability to be able, so to say, to park it in deciding what our environmental policy should be.
Duncan?
No, I agree, and I think there's how we should think about the sustainability of government debt, or the government's overall balance sheet is an interesting question. I think the fiscal rules that we have in place now after this budget are more sensible than the fiscal rules we had in place in the early 2010s. They give room for borrowing for investment of up to 3% of GDP. It's carved out away from the others, rather than borrowing for consumption. That all makes a lot of sense to me. I think there is an argument, as has been made a few times before, that the government should care more about both sides of its balance sheet. The focus tends to be on just its liabilities and its debt. But if it is, given the government can borrow, 1% in nominal terms for the next 10 years, if the government can find projects which it thinks the return to the economy is higher than that, which really should not be that hard to find. I think there is an argument that we shouldn't just think of that as debt. We should look at both sides of the balance sheet. What is the government investing in? And I think that's a particularly useful framework for thinking about some of these net zero transition costs, because there are going to be very substantial costs. And what's fascinating to me is when you look at the projections from the Climate Change Committee, which forecasts this for the government, says what posts are needed. We spend an awful lot of money in the 2020s and the 2030s for benefits in the 2040s and 2050s, and it makes sense. It makes sense to borrow now to insulate buildings, and then for the next 30 to 40 years to enjoy lower energy costs from those buildings and to recoup that borrowing slowly over time.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you both for such an interesting session. And I think we have a lot to think about. Maybe some of us listening can advise the government. On that note, thank you again and hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.